Above. The summer Opal Sutton turned 23. She learned that the two things most likely to get you killed in the Texas Hill Country were rattlesnakes and secrets. She'd managed to avoid the first her entire life. The second had been following her for 6 years without her knowing it, coiled and patient, waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. She felt the horse go down before she heard. 1 second Opal was riding hard through the cedar brake south of the Frio River, the blood-warm August air. Tearing at her hair, the stolen ledger pressed flat against her ribs beneath her riding jacket. The next, her mare's right foreleg buckled with a sound like a green branch snapping, and the world tipped sideways in a violent, lurching roll. Opal hit the caliche ground hard enough to knock every molecule of air out of her lung. She lay on her back in the scrub brush, staring up at a Texas sky gone the color of a bruise, the stars just beginning to appear at the edges of the fading light. And she thought very clearly, this is how it ends. The mare had broken her leg clean in a prairie dog hole. Opal knew what that meant. She forced herself to her feet, her left shoulder screaming where it had taken the brunt of the fall, and she did what needed doing with the small revolver she carried in her coat pocket. She didn't cry. She had run out of tears somewhere around Uvalde, 2 days and 60 hard miles back. What she had not run out of was the will to keep moving. She checked that the ledger was still strapped tight to her body. It was. 12 years of fraudulent land deeds, falsified probate records, and the names of judges who'd been paid to look the other way. All of it documented in the cramped, meticulous handwriting of her stepfather, Rutherford Crane, the man who had stolen her mother's land the week after her mother's funeral. The man whose hired riders were now, at this very moment, somewhere behind her in the darkening brush. Above. Opal pulled her jacket tighter, oriented herself by the last sliver of sunset, and started walking north. She didn't make it far. The fever came on fast, the way it always does in the Texas summer when you've hit the ground hard enough to rattle your teeth and spent 2 nights sleeping in creek beds. By the time she smelled wood smoke on the night air, she was walking with one hand on the cedar branches to keep herself upright, and the stars had developed halos she was fairly certain were not meteorological in origin. The cabin sat in a shallow draw off the main creek, nearly invisible in the dark. Low stone walls, a tin roof, a single window lit from within by the amber glow of a kerosene lamp. She registered all of this the way you register things when your body is shutting itself down, distantly, with a strange, dreamlike clarity. She got within 10 yards of the door before her knees simply stopped cooperating. She went down in the dust of the yard. The door opened almost immediately. He filled the frame the way a cliff face fills a horizon, broad and impassive and seemingly permanent. The kerosene light behind him threw his face into shadow, but she could see the rifle in his right hand and the absolute stillness with which he held it, the stillness of a man who did not startle and did not panic and had learned long ago that whatever came through the dark was best met without flinching. "Don't," Opal managed, from the ground. Her voice came out considerably smaller than she intended. "Don't shoot me. I'm not armed." A pause. Then the man stepped off the porch and she got her first real look at him. He was somewhere in his late 30s, weathered in the particular way of men who spent most of their lives outdoors, with dark eyes and a week's worth of beard, and the kind of quiet, contained expression that gave away nothing. He crouched down beside her, set the rifle across his knees, and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck the way you check a fence post for rot, efficiently, without ceremony. "You're burning up," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "I'm aware," Opal said. He looked at her for a moment. Whatever calculation he was running behind those dark eyes, he ran it quickly. Post. He stood, set the rifle against the porch post, and picked her up off the ground in one motion, the way you pick up something you intend to carry a distance. His name, she would learn later, was Callum Hard. He had run cattle in this part of the hill country for 11 years and spoken to fewer than 30 people in the last 2 of them. And he had opinions about both of those facts that he kept to himself. He laid her on the cot near the stove and moved around the single room with the quiet efficiency of a man long accustomed to solving problems alone. Water, a clean cloth. The iron stove fed until it threw real heat. Opal lay still and let him work and tried to calculate through the fog of fever exactly how much danger she was in of. It was when he reached for the buttons of her riding jacket that she came back to herself with a jolt that was almost physical. Don't. Her hand came up and caught his wrist. He stopped immediately, which she had not expected. Please. The word cost her something. Please don't take it off. He sat back on his heels and looked at her, not with irritation, not with suspicion, exactly. More the way a man looks at a problem that just got more complicated than he anticipated. Your jacket is soaked through, he said. You've got a fever of about 103 by my reckoning, and wet cloth against skin in that condition is going to make it worse. I know that. Then you know I need to take it off. You can't. Her fingers tightened on his wrist. She had strong hands for a woman. Her mother had always said that. If you see what's underneath, if anyone knows I have it. She stopped. Even now, even burning up with fever in a stranger's cabin, the habit of caution was deeply ingrained. There are men behind me on the trail. Dangerous men. I don't want you involved. Callum Hard looked at her for a long moment. The fire popped in the iron stove. Somewhere outside, a screech owl called once and went silent. Ma'am, he said, with a patience that somehow did not feel condescending. I live alone in a stone cabin 40 miles from the nearest town, and I have for 2 years. I think I'm already about as uninvolved in the world as a man can get now. He met her eyes. Either you let me get that jacket off, or I'm going to watch you sweat yourself into a worse condition than you're already in, and I'll have to deal with the consequences of that instead. Your choice. Opal looked at him. She looked at his hands, the knuckles scarred, the palms calloused, the grip on her wrist careful and not at all tight. She looked at his face, which was not the face of a man who frightened easily or lied well, or had any particular interest in doing either. She closed her eyes and turned her face toward the wall. All right, she said. Go ahead. He unbuttoned the jacket with the same efficiency he'd applied to everything else. No curiosity in his hands, no hesitation. He pulled the wet canvas away from her shoulders, and then he stopped. Opal heard the shift in his breathing before she heard anything else, a small, involuntary catch, like a man who has stepped wrong on a dark stair. She didn't turn to look at him. Strapped across her torso, bound flat against her ribs with 2 lengths of leather cord and a piece of oilcloth to keep it dry, was the ledger, 12 inches by 8. Half an inch thick. Its cover was green cloth, worn at the corners, with a small brass clasp that had been fitted with a lock. And hanging from that lock on a thin silver chain, pressing a cold circle into her skin just above her sternum, was a badge. A Texas Ranger's badge, star-shaped, hammered silver, with a specific serial number stamped into the lower point. Callum leaned forward, close enough that she could hear his breath, and read the number. And then the sound he made was not a catch but something more absolute. A full structural silence, the kind that falls when something inside a person breaks. Opal turned to look at him. His face had gone the color of bleached limestone. His jaw was set, and his hands were pressed flat on his thighs, and she understood in that moment that whatever she had expected his reaction to be, it was not this. Where did you get that? He said. It was not a question. I stole it, Opal said carefully, from my stepfather, Rutherford Crane. The name hit him the way physical force hits a man who isn't braced for it. She watched him absorb it, watched him work to keep his face still and fail, just barely at the eyes. Crane, he repeated. You know him. That badge, Callum said, his voice dropping into a register she hadn't heard from him yet. Low and rough, and with something underneath it that sounded like it had been suppressed for a very long time, belonged to my brother, Dawson Hard. He was a Texas Ranger. He was killed 6 years ago, investigating fraudulent land seizures in Uvalde County. He paused. They said he fell from his horse in a flood crossing. They said it was an accident. The silence between them stretched out long enough that Opal could hear the cedar outside the window moving in the night wind. It wasn't an accident, she said quietly. I know that now. I found the ledger, Bub. It's all in there. Every parcel of land Crane stole. Every official he bribed. Every transaction he falsified. And there's a page. She stopped, made herself continue. There's a page that isn't land records. It's a list of names. Men who got too close to what Crane was doing. Men who needed to be dealt with. She looked at him steadily. Your brother's name is on that list. Crane hired someone, a man named Aldrich Drum. Callum Hard stood up from the cot. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, one hand braced against the stone wall, looking out at the dark. Opal watched him and said nothing. There are moments in which silence is the only honest response, and she had learned in 23 years of living in the shadow of a man like Rutherford Crane to recognize them. "How did you get it?" he said finally, without turning around. "My mother died 18 months ago," Opal said. "Crane was her second husband. She married him when I was 16, and I believed for a long time that he was just a hard man, a cold man. I didn't understand what he was." She paused. "When she died, he moved fast. Had her will contested, had the land transferred to his name inside of 3 weeks. I got a lawyer in San Antonio to look at the paperwork, and the lawyer said it looked wrong, but he couldn't prove it. And 2 days later, the lawyer got a visit that convinced him to stop looking." She was quiet for a moment, feeling the heat of the fever pooling behind her eyes. "I went through Crane's study myself. Took me 4 months of waiting for the right opportunity. The ledger was in a locked box behind the false back of his wardrobe." She looked at the green cloth cover, still strapped to her ribs. "The night I took it, I found the badge in the same box. I didn't know what it was at first. I found out later when I looked up the serial number in the ranger records in Austin." Callum turned from the window. He came back to the cot, sat down on the low stool beside it, and for the first time since he'd seen the badge, he looked directly at her. "They're coming after the ledger," he said. "Not you." "Both," Opal said. "But mostly the ledger. If that ledger reaches a federal judge, Crane loses everything. The land, the money, the protection of the men he's bought. He has 6 men riding after me. I've been 2 days ahead of them. I don't know how much longer that holds." Callum was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, with the same calm practicality he'd applied to her fever, "How far back?" "A day, maybe less, now that my horse is gone." He nodded slowly, as if this were information he was filing away. He reached out and, with the same careful efficiency as before, began rebinding the oilcloth around the ledger and the cord around her ribs. His hands were steady. She noticed that. She noticed that whatever was happening inside him, and something was clearly happening, something large and long contained, it had not made it into his hands. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch." "You don't have to do this," Opal said. "This isn't your fight." He looked at her, and for just a moment something moved through his expression that was not calm and was not practical and was not contained at all. "6 years ago," he said, "I let my brother ride into Uvalde County alone because I thought he could handle it. I told myself it wasn't my fight either." He stood up. "Get some sleep, Opal." She slept. She woke in the gray hour before dawn to the sound of Callum moving quietly around the cabin, and through the small window she could see the first pale suggestion of light over the cedar ridge to the east. He was at the table, loading a rifle she didn't recognize, a long-barreled thing that looked older than the cabin, with the focused attention of a man who had made a decision and was now simply executing it. On the table beside the rifle was a Colt revolver, fully loaded. He pushed it toward her when he heard her sit up. "2 of them came up from the south in the night," he said, without looking up from the rifle. "I heard the horses around midnight. They're camped about half a mile down the creek. The others will join them from the north road by mid-morning." Opal sat up, her shoulder aching, the fever reduced to a low-grade hum by sleep, and whatever Callum had put in the broth she had apparently drunk without fully remembering. She looked at the revolver. "There are 6 of them," she said. "I know, and the man who leads them," she stopped. "His name is Aldrich Drum. He's the one Crane hired to kill your brother. He's very good at what he does." Callum looked up from the rifle then. His eyes met hers across the small cabin, and in the early gray light she could see the lines in his face with a clarity the kerosene lamp had softened, and she understood that whatever she had thought this man was when he first appeared in that doorway, remote, removed, self-contained to the point of absence, she had been wrong. He was not a man who had stopped feeling. He was a man who had learned, out of some deep necessity, to feel things very slowly and very quietly, the way a fire burns in a deep stone hearth. "He's here," Callum said, "which is the first piece of luck I've had in 6 years." Opal rose from the cot, pulled on her jacket, and took the revolver from the table. It was heavy and well-balanced, and she checked the cylinder automatically, the way her grandfather had taught her when she was 10 years old, and Callum noticed and said nothing, which she appreciated. They heard them before they saw them. the specific sound of men on horseback moving through cedar brush, not bothering with quiet. Men who believed they had the numbers, and therefore didn't need the patience. 4 riders came into the clearing from the north. 2 more materialized from the creek side. At the front, on a gray horse with a good deal of bone to it, rode a man in a black duster, lean and long-faced, with the kind of eyes that don't move quickly because they don't need to. Aldrich Drum. Beside him, on a bay that was too fine for the company it was keeping, rode Rutherford Crane. Opal's breath caught. She had not known Crane was with them. She had assumed he'd stay in Uvalde, at his desk, with his lawyers, the way powerful men usually did. The fact that he was here meant the ledger frightened him more than she'd understood. Or she did. Well now. Crane's voice carried easily in the still morning air. He was a compact man in his 50s, silver-haired and well-dressed, with the particular smoothness of a man who had learned early that presentation was its own kind of armor. I don't know whose cabin this is, friend, but I think you've gotten yourself into something you don't understand. Send the girl out with what she took from me, and I will personally ensure there are no unpleasant consequences for your hospitality. Callum said from beside the window without raising his voice. Aldrich Drum. The lean man on the gray horse went very still. My name is Callum Hard. My brother was Dawson Hard. He was a Texas Ranger, and you killed him in Uvalde County 6 years ago and made it look like an accident. A pause. I've been waiting to say that to you for a long time. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses stopped moving. Crane's composed face cracked, just slightly, around the edges, not into fear, but into the particular expression of a man whose careful architecture is developing an unforeseen fault. Drum looked at Crane. Something passed between them. Then Drum said quietly to the men around him, "Take the cabin." What happened in the next 4 minutes was loud and fast and very close. The men came at the cabin from 2 sides simultaneously, which was tactically sound and would have worked against most opponents. Callum was not most opponents. He moved through the small space with an economy that Opal would think about later. No wasted motion, no hesitation, no panic, placing himself and the rifle exactly where they needed to be and keeping Opal's position in his awareness, the way a man keeps his footing in uncertain terrain, constantly, automatically. She took the back wall. The first man through the rear window caught the flat of the revolver across his temple and went down without firing. The second was faster. He got through the back door before she was ready, and she fired twice, and the second shot caught him in the shoulder and he went down, and her hands were shaking when she recocked the hammer. "Hold your ground," Callum had said, just before it started. Whatever you hear from my side, hold your ground and keep the back clear." She held her ground. By the time the sound of gunfire at the front of the cabin stopped, there were 2 men down in the clearing and 1 retreating at speed on horseback south toward the creek. Through the shattered front window, Opal could see Drum still on his gray horse, which had not moved through any of it, and Crane, whose bay was dancing sideways, whites showing around the eyes. Drum had a rifle trained on the window. Callum was crouched below the sill, reloading. "Your brother begged," Drum called out, and his voice was conversational and utterly without heat, which was worse than anger would have been. "Just so you know, they always say the Ranger types don't, but they do." Opal watched Callum's hands on the rifle mechanism. They did not stop moving. They did not shake. "Hard," she said quietly. He looked up. "There are things men say," she said, "when they're standing behind 5 horses and 2 guns, that aren't true. That are said specifically because they know what they'll do to you." She met his eyes. "Don't let him do it." Something shifted in his face, not relief, exactly. Something older than relief, like a door in a long-locked room opening the first inch. He finished reloading. He stood up. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. Drum fired first. He was very fast and very accurate, and the shot took the window frame 6 inches from Callum's right ear. Callum returned fire once. Aldrich Drum fell from the gray horse. For a moment Rutherford Crane sat absolutely still on his bay, surrounded by the wreckage of his morning, and Opal could see him calculating. The ledger, the badge, the surviving men, the distance to the nearest town, the distance to the nearest judge he'd already paid. Then she heard him spur the horse. She was already at the back door. She went out through the rear of the cabin, around the north side. and cut him off at the edge of the clearing before he reached the cedar line. She stepped into the path of the bay with the revolver leveled, and the horse stopped short, and Crane hauled on the reins and looked down at her from the saddle with an expression she recognized. The one he'd used on her mother, on lawyers, on county officials. The expression that said, "You are not a serious obstacle." Opal pulled the ledger out from under her jacket and held it up so he could see it clearly. 12 years, she said, every parcel, every name, every judge, and Dawson Hard's name on the list. Her voice was steady in a way that surprised her. "It all goes to the federal marshal in San Antonio. Today, Dove. And you are going to sit down off that horse, and you are going to wait for him, or I am going to shoot you in the leg, and you are going to wait for him anyway." Crane looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the revolver, he looked at the ledger, he got down off the horse. Callum came around the side of the cabin and stopped when he saw them. He looked at Crane on the ground and Opal standing over him and said nothing for a moment. "There's rope in the barn," Opal said, "if you don't mind." He was gone and back in under a minute. They rode into Uvalde 3 abreast, Callum and Opal on horseback, Crane roped and walking between them with a dignity that was steadily deteriorating under the late morning August sun. The federal marshal's office was on the main street, next to the bank. They tied Crane to the post out front with the same rope. The marshal, a heavy-set man named Gruber who looked like he had seen a great many things and was prepared to see several more, listened to the account in full, examined the ledger, examined the badge, and examined Crane, who had progressed from dignity to silence, and then told them to wait. They waited outside on the wooden steps in the full heat of noon. After a while, Callum said, "Where were you heading?" "Before your horse went down." "San Antonio," Opal said. "Federal court." She paused. "I don't have much waiting for me there. I don't have much waiting for me anywhere, particularly. My mother's land is going to take time to recover through the courts, and I don't have the money for a long legal fight." "There's a territorial land office in Del Rio," Callum said, looking out at the street. "A federal one, with a proper claims process. If the ledger is as complete as you say it is, the process would be shorter than you think. Do you know someone there?" "I know where it is." He was quiet for a moment. "The ledger needs to get there. Needs someone to make sure it gets there without another 6 riders deciding it shouldn't." He paused again, and this time the pause had a particular shape to it. "My brother's case needs to be officially reopened and closed right. Someone needs to make that happen." Another pause. "Hill country between here and Del Rio is rough going alone." Opal looked at him. "Are you offering to ride with me, Callum Hard?" He kept looking at the street. A muscle moved in his jaw. "I'm pointing out practical considerations," he said. She almost smiled. It was the first time in quite a while that she had come anywhere close. "All right," she said. "Practical considerations." Marshal Gruber came out with paperwork and a deputy, and the news that a warrant for Rutherford Crane's arrest had been wired to 3 counties simultaneously, and that they would both be needed for depositions, and that the ledger would be held as evidence, but a certified copy would be sent to Del Rio, above, and that the badge number 214 of the Texas Rangers, would be formally returned to the Hard family and entered into the official record as recovered. Callum took the badge from the marshal's hand and held it for a moment without looking at it. Then he tucked it into his breast pocket, over his heart, and buttoned the pocket closed. They left Uvalde as the afternoon light went golden and long, across the hill country, the shadows of the cedar trees reaching east in thin dark lines across the limestone. Callum rode slightly ahead, the way a man rides when he knows the terrain and has elected to be responsible for it. Opal rode beside him when the trail widened, and behind him when it narrowed, and she noticed that each time she fell behind he slowed until she came even again. It was a small thing. She noticed it anyway. The hill country rolled out before them in the late heat, complicated and beautiful, and full of the particular silence that lives between one thing ending and the next thing beginning. Opal had carried the weight of the ledger against her ribs for 6 days, and the absence of it, even though she knew it was safe, even though she could trace the entire chain of its custody in her mind, felt enormous. Like setting down something so heavy you'd forgotten it was possible to stand upright without it. She thought about her mother's land, about the legal fight ahead, about Del Rio and the federal office, and whatever came after that, about a stone cabin in a cedar draw, low and quiet against the hillside, waiting for someone to come back to it. She thought about a man who had learned to be alone so thoroughly he had almost forgotten it was a choice. The trail narrowed again, and she fell in behind him, and this time he didn't slow. He glanced back once over his shoulder just to confirm she was there, and faced forward again. It was enough. Above, the sun went down ahead of them like a coal sinking into deep water, and the Texas sky came up purple and then black and full of stars, and they rode on through it toward whatever came next. Not running, not hiding, but moving forward, the way people do when the thing that was chasing them is finally, irrevocably gone.